In the autumn of 1888, the East End of London lived in terror. A killer stalked the streets, horribly mutilating prostitutes. He was never caught, and the legend of Jack the Ripper was born. His identity has remained a mystery ever since, but by piecing together the missing evidence, we can at last reveal his name. Incredibly, the Ripper was a man who appeared in official reports, yet somehow evaded suspicion. This investigation discovers how the killer was caught red-handed, yet talked his way past the police. For 120 years, Jack the Ripper has been hiding in plain sight.
And that was when I said, that is him, it has to be.
Helsingborg, Sweden. This quiet Scandinavian town seems an unlikely location to unmask Britain's most elusive serial killer. But it's here that a newspaper journalist has spent the last 30 years sifting through the evidence, searching for the overlooked clue that would unravel the case.
As a journalist, you do try to look at the facts and you do try to build yourself a framework, and you quickly realize it's a complete labyrinth. It involves hundreds and thousands of people. It involves a couple of hundred of suspects. But one always has the feeling that somewhere in it there will be that grain of sand that could provide a solution.
The identity of Jack the Ripper is the greatest mystery in the history of British crime. It seems incredible that a man who killed 6 women in the face of a massive manhunt, a media storm, and increasing political outrage could escape detection. But somehow he did. Ever since, many different suspects have emerged. In the 1960s, a lawyer named Montague Druitt was suggested because his suicide coincided with the end of the Ripper killing spree. In the 1970s, the murders were attributed to the elaborate plot by the Duke of Clarence and his surgeon Sir William Gull to hide the identity of a pregnant mistress. And in the 1990s, American quack Dr. Francis Tumblety came under suspicion because it was alleged he kept a collection of female body parts. There have been many, many more. But not one suspect has ever been placed at a single murder site.
Very many of the suspects are outright outlandish, and there never was a suspect that functioned practically. There never was anything that tied any one of them very much to any of the murders.
The few pieces of solid evidence that have come to light have been quickly discredited. A diary supposedly written by a wealthy cotton merchant was admitted to be a forgery. Medical records linking an eminent Welsh doctor to a victim were secretly altered. And most recently, a shawl purported to belong to one of the victims was never listed among her possessions by the police. And the DNA analysis that linked it contained major scientific errors. After more than a century of searching, the identity of the Ripper was no nearer a solution. Yet Christer Holmgren was convinced that if the killer was to be found, he would be hidden amongst the army of ordinary men living in Whitechapel.
Actually, we know that most killers of this type are people who have a propensity to melt into the woodwork. You don't see them, you don't realize them, you don't think that they would have done it.
Applied criminologist Dr. Gareth Norris has compiled a profile of the killer. He agrees he would have been an unremarkable local man.
It's very interesting to go back examine these cases and to try and work out in a very methodical way the type of person who may have committed these crimes. We can start to understand what is he doing, where is he going, and how does he know how to select his victims. The pivotal thing is the geography of the crimes. It's that there's somebody who has intimate knowledge of that area to not only identify where he will locate his victims, but it's also very easy for him to escape. So my profile suggests somebody who lives locally. He was somebody who was able to fit in quite easily. He was able to go about his business. Certainly as somebody who had reason really to be out in the streets at that time, and I wouldn't have seemed out of place at that time.
In the century since the Ripper killings, criminologists have developed a much clearer understanding of the kind of men who commit serial murder. They're known to develop their violent urges in childhood, but often suppress them well into adulthood.
One of the things that we often find amongst serial killers is that they live very kind of troubled backgrounds. Certainly, he would have had some kind of underlying pathology. These were well thought out fantasies, which generally take a long time to develop. This was somebody who was potentially older, so it's probably someone in their mid to late 30s, perhaps even up to early 40s.
Buried in the evidence collected by the police, there is a man who fits this profile. Crucially, the records show he was found at the scene of one of the killings, but he was never a suspect. For Krista Holmgren, the breakthrough lay in the details of the extraordinary murder of the Ripper's second victim, Polly Nichols, and in the baffling circumstances that helped create the Ripper legend. The phantom killer with an apparently supernatural ability to evade capture.
At the inquest into the Polly Nichols murder, the coroner said that it was nothing less than astonishing that the killer had managed to escape, given the circumstances.
Nichols was killed on Bucks Row, a long narrow street mostly overlooked by terraced houses and with no immediate escape routes. Just 15 minutes before Polly Nichols was killed, a policeman passed the murder site on his regular beat. The street was deserted. At both ends of Bucks Row, 2 other policemen passed every half hour, and there were several night watchmen within earshot. It seemed impossible for the killer to escape. Yet buried within contemporary newspaper reports of the discovery of Nichols' body, Krista believes he has worked out how he did it.
The picture we have of the Polly Nichols murder today is not the way it panned out at the time. When we take a look at the original paper articles, we can see that nobody had the correct picture of things.
At the first day of the public inquest into Nichols' death, the police described how they had found the body.
The newspaper articles that are all very similar in describing what had happened. A policeman, PC John Neal, had found a body, and that was it until the next day, when something exploded in the face of the police.
The explosion took the form of a sensational newspaper interview that hit the streets of Whitechapel. A man called Robert Paul claimed that he had found the body before the police, and when he did, there was another man standing over it.
It was a very dramatic wording, and that was obviously a major shock to the police.
At the time, the man described by Paul was obviously unknown to the police. Yet the day after the newspaper interview, he appeared at the inquest. He gave his name as Charles Allen Cross and said he worked as a car man or delivery driver. He admitted that he was the first person to find the body. When Krista discovered this odd episode in the Ripper story, he became suspicious. Why did such a crucial witness not come forward more willingly?
For the person who found the body to just disappear and then reappear on the second day of the inquest, that's something that's quite unique. Strange, I thought.
Krista tried to find out more about the elusive Charles Cross, but the mystery only deepened. He'd given his address to the inquest as 22 Doveton Street in Whitechapel. However, the official records show no one called Cross living at that address.
There is the strange fact that this Carmen Cross, who gave his name and his address to the police, was subsequently found out not to be living at the address he had given.
So who was Charles Cross? When Krista Holmgren found the answer, it unlocked a mass of incriminating evidence. Evidence that convinced him that the reluctant witness was actually Jack the Ripper. Now he's heading for London to prove it.
Whatever I find about this man will go to confirm his guilt. It will not go to clear him. I realized that, wow, here he is, Jack the Ripper.
After 20 years investigating the Whitechapel murders, Swedish journalist Krista Holmgren is convinced that he has discovered the man we know as Jack the Ripper. He believes a reluctant witness found standing over the body of the Ripper's second victim, Polly Nichols, was in fact the killer. Dr. Andy Griffiths, former head of Sussex Police Murder Squad, has agreed to read the inquest reports and assess Krista's suspect.
The relevance of those documents isn't lost by them being so old. You know, no matter how much things change, most cases still come down to witnesses and looking at what people say.
Andy's murder squad solved 97% of its cases whilst he was in charge. He believes that if the Polly Nichols case was being handled today, Charles Cross would come under intense scrutiny.
From a police point of view, the person who finds a body in circumstances like this is always going to be significant to an inquiry. And we would start from the basis of seeking to eliminate that person from the investigation. Certainly in the modern age, you couldn't prosecute anybody else without eliminating him first, because obviously you've got someone who's been with the body very close to the point of death and possibly is the person who caused the death. So he is definitely a very significant person in terms of the investigation.
It's good to have it confirmed, and it's good to have it laid out in no uncertain terms. To me, the most important matter at the inquest was what I think is a blatant lie presented to take Cross past the police.
On the night of the murder, a policeman called Jonas Meisen was out on his beat when he encountered Charles Cross. Cross had just left the scene of the crime with co-witness Robert Paul. Paul had set off to find a policeman, but when the two men saw Constable Meisen, it was Cross who went to speak to him. At the inquest, PC Meisen recounted their conversation. He revealed that Charles Cross told him two key things: that a woman was lying in Bucks Row, and then that there was a policeman with her who had requested assistance. Yet Cross knew there was no policeman with the body. It seems he was lying.
The first lie was the one about him simply playing down the seriousness of the errand. The second lie would be that he said that another PC was in place.
If I focus on Police Constable Meisen, here is an experienced officer. When you look at his record, he served for over 20 years with nothing to his detriment, and also the fact that, here is a person used to giving evidence, professional witness, if you like, and he's got no reason not to tell the truth. A death is a death. It's always a serious event, and policemen of any era would react in a particular way. But a much more vague message of there's a woman lying in the street,
yes,
coupled with the information that another police officer is already there, would lower his response.
There was a very good risk that Meisen would have detained him, taken him back to the place for the murder, So what I think we got here is a perfectly shaped lie to take Cross past the police.
Believing that Charles Cross was simply passing on a message from an officer at the scene, Constable Meisen let him go on his way. Yet in a remarkable twist of fate, when PC Meisen reached the crime scene, there actually was a policeman there. Local Bobby PC Neal had found the body on his regular beat.
Strangely, of course, when he gets the body, there is another police constable there.
There is.
So part of what was said to him sort of came true.
Meisen would have seen absolutely no reason at all to disbelieve. So it becomes a stroke of genius.
Yeah, stroke of genius or luck.
Had PC Neal not found the body in the meantime, Constable Meisen would have realized that Cross had lied, and a manhunt would surely have ensued. Ultimately, though, Cross was flushed out. When Robert Paul's newspaper interview revealed his presence at the scene that night, Cross had no choice but to come forward to the inquest. But when he appeared, he gave the coroner a false name.
He would have been duty-bound to give his correct name when giving evidence on oath. So the fact he didn't, it just adds to that tally of things that don't look quite right. There is no doubt that as an investigator, Cross is of tremendous interest. He is completely relevant. And there are numerous factors here that make him a very, very interesting person indeed.
Despite his suspicious behavior at the time, Cross's deception was not uncovered, and he drifted into obscurity. Then in 2005, a group of amateur enthusiasts started to investigate Charles Cross and solved the mystery of his identity. They noticed that at the address Charles Alan Cross had given the inquest, a man called Charles Alan Lechmere was registered as head of the family. The two men shared the same first and middle names. Was it a coincidence? Scouring the records charting Lechmere's life, they searched for evidence that they might be the same person. In an 1861 census record, they found the breakthrough they were looking for. In it, Charles Alan Lechmere was recorded with the surname Cross. He was 12 years old and registered under the name of his stepfather at the time, Thomas Cross. In all, there are 120 official documents charting the life of the man who, at the inquest, called himself Cross. In 119, his name is Charles Alan Lechmere. Once Christa had his real name, it launched the next phase of his investigation. The breakthrough opened the door to a deluge of spine-tingling new evidence. Christa started to believe that he'd finally found Jack the Ripper. After 30 years studying the case of Jack the Ripper, Christa Holmgren made a dramatic breakthrough. Christa had identified a man acting suspiciously at the scene of the second murder. He lied to a policeman on the night of the crime and gave a false name at the inquest. But did he lie about anything else? When Christa discovered that his suspect's real name was Charles Lechmere, he could confirm where he lived and where he worked. Now he can thoroughly check the story he gave at the inquest. Christa is joined by ex-murder squad chief Andy Griffiths. His experience will prove invaluable if Christa is to uncover further inconsistencies in Lechmere's version of events from the night of the murder. There was one key aspect of Lechmere's story that raised alarm bells with Christa. Lechmere's walk to work took him within yards of Robert Paul's house. The two men shared the same route, yet both Paul and Lechmere claim they saw no one else that morning. If they really were just seconds apart, they should have seen each other well before Bucks Row.
the two should have walked in tandem, more or less, 30 or 40 yards, nothing more than that in between them. And yet nobody speaks about having noticed the other man walking right beside them, more or less.
Now Krista and Andy can check whether Lechmere's version of events made sense.
Charles Lechmere lived here at 22 Doveton Street.
He lived here,
and
yeah.
now I'm really interested in the timing.
He said at the inquest that he left at 3:30. Some reports say 3:20, but the more common reports say 3:30.
OK, so we've got our start time of 3:30. Let's time the walk from here to the body.
OK, here we go.
At the inquest, Lechmere claimed he found Polly Nichols lying in Bucks Row on his way to work. He also claimed he was immediately joined by the second witness, Robert Paul. The street layout is the same now as it was over a century ago. Krista and Andy time Lechmere's route to the murder site. According to Paul's evidence, Lechmere found the body some 16 minutes after he claimed he left home.
Here?
OK, and stop. And it says 7 minutes, 7 seconds. That would have meant that if Lechmere left his home, as he said, at 3:30, he should have been here at 3:37.
Well, that's very interesting because Paul says that he came into the street at 3:45.
Yeah.
Andy and Krista seem to have found a major discrepancy in Lechmere's story. Lechmere said that he was never alone with the body. But Lechmere would have reached the murder site at 3:37, long before Paul turned into the street at 3:45.
And of course, the other thing about Paul was we know that he was late for work, as he said at the inquest.
Yeah.
And I think it's reasonable to assume then he was keeping an eye on the time.
Then we got a discrepancy of about 9 minutes or something like that.
Which is a big difference in that time.
It seems Lechmere was with Polly Nichols for a lot longer than he admitted. Was it enough time for him to kill her? Forensic physician Jason Payne-James has assessed the post-mortem report. Using a forensic graphical model, he calculates how long Polly Nichols' injuries would have taken to inflict.
Well, here we have a bruise running along the lower part of the jaw on the right side of the face. These are the kind of marks consistent with manual strangulation. We then have injuries to the neck. The incision completely severed all the tissues down to the vertebrae. Either side of the neck, here and here, are the neurovascular bundles. So if she was not already dead, would undoubtedly have killed her.
In all, Dr. Payne-James identifies 12 major stab injuries to Polly Nichols.
Contrasting the injuries to Polly Nichols with some of the other victims, clearly what we have here is no removal of organs, no removal of skin tissue. Realistically, I think the entire process lasted no more than a couple of minutes.
It took the murderer as little as 2 minutes to take the life of Polly Nichols. If it was Lechmere, the time he possibly had alone with her would have been enough. But if Lechmere had just killed Nichols, why wasn't he covered in blood? Lechmere spoke to 2 people immediately after the murder. Surely they would have noticed blood on him. But Dr. Payne-James believes that the killer would not necessarily have had blood on his hands.
I think there's always an assumption that somebody stabbed to death, there's going to be blood everywhere. I think it's entirely possible that there wouldn't necessarily be large amounts, or indeed any blood necessarily obvious on that person.
Dr. Payne-James has worked out that, like the other victims, Polly Nichols was strangled to death first. Without blood pressure, there would have been no arterial spray. A simple demonstration can illustrate the dramatic effect of a knife attack on a living victim.
What we have here is a very simplistic system containing fluid to mimic blood. I'm going to cut this vessel and we're going to see what happens. And quite dramatically, you can see with a higher pressure system, you would see this repeated spray.
When the heart is beating, any cutting of major arteries will result in a spray of blood. Polly Nichols' crime scene showed little signs of blood, suggesting that she was dead before the Ripper used his knife.
Although we know that carotid arteries were cut, it would seem that that was after death. So it may just leak out and dribble out or drain out around the contours of the neck, in this case, over a period of minutes.
Lechmere not only had the time to kill Polly Nichols, he would have also been relatively clean of blood. Could Lechmere's behavior at the murder site throw up any more clues?
So it's head that direction, feet that direction. This is how she was lying.
When Robert Paul entered Bucks Row, he didn't see Charles Lechmere for a full minute. If Lechmere had been crouching in the shadows, that would not be surprising. But Krista points out that Lechmere should have been aware of Paul's approach almost immediately.
Now we have Charles Lechmere telling us that he doesn't hear Robert Paul until he's 30 or 40 yards away. And that is extremely odd, because at that time, people had hard-soled shoes, and they would sound like hammers as they walked down the street. What I think is that he heard Paul from a much longer distance. He must have been disturbed, and then he would have had just a little time to do something about the body.
The notion that Nichols' killer was disturbed in the act is supported by two details. First, compared to the other Ripper killings, her injuries were less extensive, suggesting the killer had to prematurely curtail his plans. Second, the victim's clothes were pulled down to hide her abdominal injuries. Andy Griffiths thinks that given the heavy police presence and the lack of easy escape route, Lechmere had no choice but to try and cover his tracks and bluff things out.
This was the only one of the Ripper victims whose wounds were not left deliberately on display in a quite grotesque way. You know, you're describing a man who's trying to cover up his work there. And certainly I think he couldn't run away, having realised there's somebody else in the street.
Krista believes Lechmere did what he could to hide Nichols' injuries, and was only seen by Robert Paul when he stepped back from the body.
So basically what we had is Lechmere standing in the middle of the street, and Paul is walking this way, trying...
Like this?
Yeah, like this. And Lechmere blocks his way.
Now, doesn't Paul get right down by the body and test for breath?
Yes, they touch the hands, the face, and Paul also touches the chest.
From his testimony, Paul says he saw no blood despite getting close enough to check her breathing. It is clear from his next action that he didn't think Polly Nichols was dead.
Paul then says, let's move her, doesn't he?
He wants to prop her up, and at that stage, Lechmere oddly says, I will not touch her.
Right, see, now I think having directed attention to the woman and gone through testing of her breath and that type of thing,
exactly,
it would appear natural to then carry that on.
Why would Lechmere refuse to move Nichols' body? If the men had moved Nichols, it would have become obvious that her throat had been cut. At that point, Robert Paul told Lechmere he would go and find a policeman. But Lechmere didn't wait by the body, he followed him. Just minutes after the two men had left the scene, PC Neal came by and found the body. He immediately noticed a pool of blood.
Well, that gives me a very, very interesting thought. One of the things that PC Neal thinks is most noticeable about the body is the pool of blood around the neck. Now, when Paul was at the body, you know, he got down close to the body, he looked for signs of life. He did not see any blood. That means that those cuts were very, very fresh. Paul sees nobody else except Lechmere in that street, and he could see beyond Lechmere when he came into the street. So it means that the possibility of another person killing the woman is remote.
Despite leaning over Nichols, Robert Paul sees no blood and gets none on his hands or clothes. The blood discovered by PC Neal had to have been incredibly fresh. With no one else in sight, that seems to put Lechmere squarely in the frame as the killer.
The timing is about the blood. They're as close as we can come to a smoking gun, I think, in this case, that the man who provided the cuts to her throats would have been Charles Allen Lechmere.
You know, if you put that to a jury, Lechmere would have some real questions to answer.
Andy Griffiths believes Lechmere had to be with one of the Ripper's victims at or extremely close to the time she was killed. But there were 5 other murders, and Charles Lechmere could link to every single one of them. Charles Lechmere's actions on the night of the murder of Polly Nichols implicate him as a prime suspect. The rate of bleeding suggests that he was with the victim at or suspiciously close to the time of death. The evidence, gathered entirely from surviving records, is still circumstantial, but the coincidences continue to point to Lechmere being Jack the Ripper. Criminologist Dr. Gareth Norris has found that hidden in the official records are clues that Lechmere's early life matches many known serial killers.
Lechmere came from what we might describe really as a broken home. Certainly have had numerous stepfathers. He never knew his biological father. Certainly that would have been something of interest. What we know about lots of serial killers is they grow up in very kind of tumultuous lifestyles. They often move around a lot.
Born in London's East End, as a child, Lechmere moved many times. By the time of the murders, he was 39 years old, married, and had fathered 12 children. Yet he always lived with or close to his mother.
His mother seems to be a pivotal person in his family. She had managed to marry 3 times, and certainly seems to be a domineering force in Charles's life. He lived with her for some time. He lived just down the road from her.
Then, just 2 months before the killings began, Lechmere moved away, leaving his eldest daughter behind with his mother. Gareth wonders whether the event hides a family trauma.
There was something potentially there, some animosity of some sort, which had caused him to move. Interestingly, also, one of his daughters stayed behind living with his mother. That also is quite peculiar. Such a big kind of upheaval in his family life at that stage, only 2 months before the murders started, is certainly potential of significance to the case.
The significance of the move becomes even more apparent when we consider the subsequent killings. His new route to work would take him right through the heart of the Ripper's territory.
He lived up here in Doveton Street. This area, approximately 25-30 minutes walk from where the majority of the crimes took place. Also of interest is where he worked. Up here, in the Broad Street goods depot, which is attached to the station. He worked there for 20 years. He knew this area well. There was a corridor there between where he lived and where he worked, and he had intimate knowledge of this area.
Charles Lechmere worked as a delivery driver for a company based at Broad Street. He started his shift at 4 a.m., working Monday to Saturday. His 2 shortest routes to his work both took 40 minutes to walk, meaning he left home well before dawn.
So the Ripper murders, very, very interesting set of patterns of behaviour which result when we look at this geographically. There are certain flags, red markers if you like, that really try to indicate that there's something that links Lechmere to these crimes. The first crime took place here, the George Yard buildings in Gunthorpe Street, Whitechapel. Martha Tabram.
Martha Tabram was murdered in a stairwell just yards from Old Montague Street, one of the most direct routes in Charles Lechmere's walk to work. The coroner said she was killed between 2:30 and 3:30 a.m., a time when Lechmere should have been passing nearby to get to his job. There were 39 stab wounds to her upper body. If Lechmere really was the Ripper, Gareth thinks the split from his mother and daughter could have triggered the attack.
Very often we find there's a significance with the first victim. This is the one that's been planned. This is the one that they've really kind of thought of and agonised over. We see it often in those cases. There is something which has happened, something which has made those people almost kind of snap, if you like. Could that have been the kind of precipitating thing that started this murder spree?
Next to be killed was Polly Nichols. Events that night illustrated perfectly the cover and opportunity his walk to work would have provided. With the third victim, Annie Chapman, the pattern continues.
She was found here, in Hanbury Street. The crime scene seems to have moved on now. She'd been cut open, her inner organs had been pulled out of her body and been found left hanging over her shoulder. Also some very specific wounds to her sexual organs.
Chapman was killed in the backyard of a house that also lay on one of Lechmere's routes to work. The medical examiner estimated that she was killed at around 4:30 a.m. Again, Lechmere would have been passing close to the murder site within minutes of her death. 3 killings occurring on his early morning routes to work. But the next 2 murders of Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes were distinctly different. The killer struck outside of his locality and comfort zone.
What's sometimes referred to as the double event. 2 murders on the same evening. Geographically, he's moved further south now. These areas down here were somewhat different from the others. Why was he travelling below this kind of psychological barrier from Whitechapel? The Whitechapel Road being an arterial route, it's a geographical or psychological boundary.
This unusual shift in location has always puzzled crime experts. But if Lechmere was the killer, the location makes perfect sense. Liz Stride was killed in the midst of the many houses that Lechmere grew up in.
Now we can see that this area also is somewhere that he would have known well. This now explains why we have a bit of a movement of the centre of gravity of these crimes down towards this area.
The connection to Charles Lechmere is possibly even clearer when it's factored in that they occurred on a Saturday night. Saturday was his only night off. Was Lechmere visiting the mother and daughter he'd recently left?
One of his daughters actually still lived with his mother down here in Cable Street. Maybe he travelled down to this area on that evening to visit them. If we think of his crimes, perhaps, rather than him as a serial killer, more as a spree killer, maybe there was something there, an argument perhaps with his mother, maybe his mother had discovered something about him.
Elizabeth Stride had her throat cut at around midnight in an alleyway leading to a stable yard, just round the corner from Charles Lechmere's mother's house. Once again, the killer was unable to finish his work.
This crime, it seemed to be one that he was disturbed. He had cut Elizabeth's throat and then left the scene at that point and moved to this area to find yet another victim.
Unsatisfied, the killer goes on the hunt for a second victim, taking the exact route Lechmere took to work for 20 years, towards a part of town where he knew he could find a victim. Within 40 minutes, he found, murdered and mutilated Catherine Eddowes in Mitre Square. The Ripper's last accepted murder happened back in Whitechapel and back on Lechmere's daily routine. Mary Kelly was attacked between 3 and 4 a.m. in a lodging house situated on a cut-through to Broad Street goods depot.
Victim number 6, Mary Jane Kelly, discovered here in Dorset Street.
Kelly's wounds were the most extreme of all the Ripper victims, with large sections of her body removed.
He's moved his crime indoors. He's caused wounds to her face, and she's been subjected to literally hours of dismemberment.
It has always been a mystery how the killer could have left Kelly's room unnoticed, when he must have been covered in blood. But there's one more tantalizing fact about Lechmere that could explain that mystery. Historian Arthur Ingram is an expert on Pickfords, the company Lechmere worked for as a horse-drawn delivery driver. His research has uncovered that Charles Lechmere's job was to deliver meat to butchers around East London.
The men of Pickfords working out of Broad Street were handling huge chunks of meat. But there'd be oddments around any carcass, whether it be liver, heart and tongue. It is a dirty job, and his clothes would be dirty, and he may be soiled with his hands or his face.
Arriving at Broad Street Depot in an apron smeared with blood would barely have raised an eyebrow. Then he could melt away into a dark warren of meat carts and stables for 300 horses.
Broad Street, because of its importance as the third largest station in London at that time, there was considerable space taken over, not only for the stables, for the horses, but for the carman to keep himself clean.
Broad Street Depot would have been an ideal hideout for a killer. It is the final marker for the three key elements of Charles Lechmere's life: home, family, and work.
If we draw a triangle around these points, we can see that all of the crimes would be contained within that triangle. Lived, worked, and where he moved to in his new location.
For Krista Holmgren, the way Lechmere's life shadows the murders has to be more than a coincidence.
Once you find out the true background of the carman and who he really was, Charles Alan Lechmere, it all fits, every single bit of it. If he wasn't the killer, then he was the unluckiest person in the world, because he suddenly developed some sort of habit of always passing by as somebody was killed in those streets. And to me, that just doesn't add up.
Remarkably, during his lifetime, Charles Lechmere evaded suspicion and survived into the 1920s, when, at a ripe old age, his image was captured on film. After 30 years of investigation, Krista Holmgren believes that Charles Alan Lechmere was Jack the Ripper. On the night of the murder of Polly Nichols, he was found standing over the body. No one saw anybody else at the scene. Her wounds were extremely fresh, and it seems Lechmere had been alone with her for longer than he admitted. He apparently then lied to the police and gave false details at the inquest. And once you discover who he really is, a series of eerie coincidences point to him being Jack the Ripper. Wearing blood-stained overalls, his job placed him at 4 of the killings at the time they occurred. Another happened by his mother's house, yet another on his old route to work. But would the case against Lechmere stand up in a modern court? Criminal barrister and Queen's Counsel James Scobie reviews the evidence against him.
The timings really hurt him, because she could have been very, very recently fatally killed. You can inflict injuries, as I'm sure pathologists will tell you, with a knife in seconds. And the question is, where were you? What were you doing during that time? Because actually, he has never given a proper answer. He is somebody who seems to be acting in a way and behaving in a way that is suspicious, which a jury would not like. A jury would not like that. When the coincidences add up, mount up against a defendant, and they mount up in his case, it becomes one coincidence too many. The fact that there is a pattern of offending, almost an area of offending, of which he is linked, geographically and physically. You add all those points together, piece it all together, and the prosecution have the most probative, powerful material the courts use against individual suspects.
After 120 years, it is highly unlikely that there will ever be the definitive proof to convict any one suspect. But James Scobie suggests that the evidence drawn together by Christa could take Charles Lechmere to a murder trial.
And what we would say is he's got a prima facie case to answer, which means there's a case good enough to put before a jury that suggests that he was the killer.
This is a Queen's Counsel, a barrister of the very highest order. So to have this confirmation from this level is very emotional to me.
Lechmere's story may not be finished. Christa Holmgren is investigating links to several more murders, and in time he plans to publish his research. Lechmere lived until he was 71, became a grandfather and a relatively wealthy man. Rich enough to pay for his photograph to be taken in 1912.
It's a strange feeling to look at him. I find my eyes are taking a look at his eyes and then at his hands. What I see here is a very self-secure, very self-conscious, slightly intimidating man.
The hunt for the Ripper is unlikely to end with Lechmere. There will doubtless be new theories and new suspects. But Christa believes that unless solid evidence emerges to the contrary, he has found the ordinary man behind the legend and proved beyond reasonable doubt that Charles Alan Lechmere was Jack the Ripper.
Coming up now on SBS 1, Sandra is alone on the case and time is running out to save Paul from certain death in our gripping French drama, Witnesses.